switch now to the issue of reparations. Joining me now is Kashik Sims Alvarado, chair of the Georgia Fulton County Reparations Task Force. Doctor, first of all, thank you for joining us tonight. Fulton County has picked up the baton of reparations that several cities have run with in the last 4 years. Your task force holding its first in-person meeting last week. In an interview you gave to local news in Atlanta, you said that among the factors that have impacted Fulton County's black residents, the task force would be looking at slavery, eminent domain, and also convict labor. And at the center of the task force initial work, is an empirical study on how black descendants of slaves have suffered from those inequities and others over time, along with the feasibility study that will take public input and recommendations into account ahead of your final report in October of next year. Now, you're an assistant professor of Africana Studies at Morehouse College there in Atlanta. You hold a PhD in history from Georgia State University. With that background, what is unique about Fulton County, about Atlanta, that drove you and the task force to take up this work?
Well, thank you for having me and shedding light on the work that we've been doing. The task force was actually formed almost 2 years ago in April 2021 in response to LA County, the supervisors of LA County investigating the return of land to the Bruce family and its heirs, of land that was taken away in the 1920s. So in response to that, our Fulton County commissioners, particularly Commissioner Marvin Arrington Jr., he sponsored a resolution, and it was actually co-authored or co-sponsored rather by Natalie Hall, to create the very first county-led Fulton, the first, let me get this right, because it's important, the first county-led reparation task force in the former Confederacy. And so that is so important when we begin to look at the history of slavery, Jim Crow, urban renewal in the United States, and considering our history of Atlanta being the epicenter of the civil rights movement, it's only fitting for Fulton County to actually begin this initiative. So I'm glad that the commissioners actually took it upon themselves to form it. It was actually supported by 4 commissioners out of 7. And it began initially with only 4 task force members being added onto this initiative. Yeah. And gradually we pushed for the county commissioners to add 2 representatives per district, and now we have our numbers up to 9.
Let me pause right there, because I don't have to tell you that as recently as a decade ago, the idea of reparations for black Americans was considered a political non-starter. Yet in the last 4 years, starting with the Chicago suburb of Evanston, Illinois, several cities, and most conspicuously the state of California, have at least considered reparative justice for black residents, with California's legislature currently looking at proposals from the state's reparations task force, which we feature here on the show several times, in fact. Did your task force take anything from the work that has been done in California or Evanston and other cities that have moved in this direction?
Oh, most definitely. They were definitely inspired by it. And I'm glad that you mentioned that before. Reparations, you would say it under your breath, and people use other words to describe reparations. Even in the 1960s with Dr. King, he used the word guaranteed income, but it still means reparations. And so it has gained traction. And what we're hoping to do with our task force is actually creating a blueprint for other county commissioners to actually create a task force. So one can actually go online to actually look at the report that we created. It lays out a blueprint of actually how to establish a task force.
Now, talking about that task force, the task force has already dealt with controversy and pushback over the summer. a Republican county commissioner alleged that you prohibited her appointee to the task force from speaking to media, an allegation you and the Democratic chair of the Board of Commissioners have clarified as untrue. But that same board chair is on record as being against reparations himself. What's your response?
Right. There was a little bit of a tension about who should actually have priority in speaking. And so as you understand, with any civil rights organization, that you must have structure. So it was clearly understood that the chair and the vice chair, myself and Marcus Coleman, would actually serve as the natural leaders in responding to the press. We have actually been the longest members of the task force, and those who spoke out of turn is that individual wasn't familiar with the history of the task force. What we simply wanted to do is for all our task force members, when they are presented to speak before the press, that they have the proper knowledge that is needed in order to respond to questions. As you know, individuals are going to be tripped up and their words can be taken out of context. But the concern is genuinely to make sure that all our
and taken out of context can't trip up the whole goal of what you're trying to do one way or another. Now, without asking too much for your political views on Fulton County Prosecutor Fannie Willis's racketeering investigation of Donald Trump, I do wonder what it's like conducting this work in the midst of the nation's eye being on Fulton County. And I'd be remiss if I ignored the racial aspects at play. The threats to Willis and her staff, the attempts by Trump and his alleged co-conspirators to invalidate the will of black voters in Georgia, and specifically its most populous and population-wise is Blackest County. Is any of that on your mind as you conduct this task force?
Well, you know, one of the things that we're actually looking at with the task force, we can only look at those areas that fall under the purview of the county. And one of those things actually consists of voting. So it's voting, healthcare, property taxes, libraries, courts, that falls under the purview of the county. But we know that Fulton County residents have been disenfranchised during the years of Jim Crow. In fact, in our studies, we may actually find that more individuals had a greater chance of voting during the years of Reconstruction than up to the case of Smith versus Alt-Right or Prentice King versus Georgia with the white primary election. So this is, you know, the history of voter fraud is nothing new. So we're familiar with all this. So we're prepared to deal with it.
Dr. Sims Alvarado, thank you for being with us. After the break,